Today, we're going to unravel one of the most important stories in all of history, the real origins of Christianity. And let me tell you, the beginning of that story, it's probably not what you think. Okay, so let's just ask the big question right up front. When did Christianity really begin? Now, if you're picturing a brand new religion just popping into existence, fully formed, well, you got to kind of rewind and rethink that whole picture. The real story? It starts somewhere completely different. See, this is the thing you gotta understand right from the start. Before it was ever called Christianity, the movement that followed Jesus was known as the Way. And it wasn't a new religion at all. It was a new and pretty energetic movement inside the world of first century Judaism. All right, so let's actually go there. Let's step back in time. To really get what the Way was all about, you have to understand the world that grew out of. And it was a vibrant and sometimes pretty intense place to be. The time period we're talking about is what historians call Second Temple Judaism. And you've got to throw out any idea you have of some single, uniform faith. No, this was more like a bustling marketplace of ideas. You had groups like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all debating scripture and what it meant to be faithful, all while seeing themselves as 100% Jewish. And it was right into this world that the Way was born. And this is absolutely crucial. Jesus was a Jew. His disciples, his earliest followers, all Jews. They weren't trying to break away or start some brand new thing. They saw their movement as a fulfillment, an affirmation of the Judaism they knew and loved. They just had one single revolutionary belief added on top. Okay, so if these folks were basically a Jewish sect, what did their day-to-day life actually look like? What did they believe and how did they live out their faith? Well, it turns out their daily life was, well, Jewish, thoroughly Jewish. I mean, you read the book of Acts, and it tells you they were still going to the temple in Jerusalem to worship. They went to their local synagogues. They kept the Sabbath, celebrated Passover, followed the kosher dietary laws, and practiced circumcision. If you saw them on the street, you wouldn't think they were anything other than observant Jews of the time. And get this Jewish identity, it's baked right into the DNA of the movement's own texts. An overwhelming majority of the New Testament was written by Jewish authors for communities that were soaked in the Hebrew scriptures. When you look at it that way, you realize the Christian Bible is, at its core, a profoundly Jewish collection of writings. So what was it? What was that one extra belief that made them different? It all boiled down to this one radical conviction, that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, the long-awaited figure that the prophets of Israel had talked about for centuries. They believed he was the one who would finally kick off that new age God had promised. But here's where things start to get complicated. As this little Jewish movement starts to gain traction, it begins to attract people who aren't Jewish, people they called Gentiles. And this created a huge identity crisis, a question that would put the movement on a path to becoming something totally new. And this right here was the million-dollar question. I mean, this was the debate that could have just ripped the whole community apart right from the start. If the Messiah is Jewish and the movement is Jewish, does a non-Jew have to completely convert to Judaism? We're talking circumcision, following all the laws of the Torah, to be a part of it? So you basically had two sides to this argument. On one hand, you had this group, sometimes called the Circumcision Party, and their logic was simple. Yes, to follow the Jewish Messiah, you have to become fully Jewish. End of story. But on the other hand, you had the Apostle Paul, and he was making a radical, totally different argument. No, faith in Jesus is what matters. Gentiles don't need to take on the whole of Jewish law. And this quote from Paul just perfectly nails his whole argument. For centuries, identity was all about following the law, about your family line. And Paul comes along and says, you know what? None of that is the main point anymore. The new center, the only thing that really counts, is faith. I mean, think about that. This was a total game changer. Okay, so this whole debate finally boiled over at this massive meeting we now call the Council of Jerusalem. Leaders like Paul, Peter, and even Jesus' own brother James all got together to hash this out for good. And their decision was huge, a total turning point. They decided that, no, Gentiles did not have to be circumcised. And that decision, right there, threw the doors wide open for this little movement to explode out into the non-Jewish world. But even after that big decision, the final split, it didn't just happen with the flip of a switch. The separation between what became Judaism and what became Christianity, well, it was more like a slow, painful divorce that took centuries to finalize. you can actually point to a few major historical earthquakes that just kept pushing the two communities further and further apart. First, in 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Jerusalem temple. This was a massive trauma for everyone, but the two groups started to interpret that disaster in very different ways. Then, decades later, another failed Jewish revolt against Rome led to Jews being banned from Jerusalem, which scattered the movement's original base. As time went on, tragically, some Christian writings started to develop an anti-Jewish theology. And finally, by the 4th century, when Christianity became the official state religion of the Roman Empire, the two had really, truly solidified into separate identities. And this growing separation, it led to something truly tragic, one of history's great injustices. Some leader Christians, completely forgetting their own Jewish heritage, started to blame all Jewish people for the death of Jesus. And that narrative, that false accusation, has caused just unbelievable suffering, and it completely flies in the face of the actual history. And let's be super clear about the history here. The Gospels themselves describe Jesus being sentenced and killed by the Roman governor. Crucifixion wasn't a Jewish practice. It was a brutal, public, Roman form of execution, something they used to make an example out of anyone who challenged their power.
Okay, so after walking through this long, complicated, sometimes painful journey, how should we think about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity today?
Well, there's a really powerful way to picture it, and it's with this metaphor of a tree. Both modern Judaism and Christianity are like two major branches that grew out of the same deep, complex root system, that world of Second Temple Judaism. They grew in different directions, for sure, but they share that same trunk of scripture, of history, and of patriarchs. All right, so let's just quickly recap the big takeaways here. First, Christianity didn't start as a new religion. It was an internal Jewish movement. Second, its earliest followers lived and worshipped as observant Jews. Third, that decision to include non-Jews without making them convert, that was the key turning point. And finally, the split wasn't sudden. It was a slow, gradual process pushed along by major historical events, but one that could never erase the deep, shared roots both faiths have in the Hebrew Scriptures. And all of this leaves us with one last thing to think about. In a world that's so often defined by religious conflict and division, how does knowing this shared, intertwined history, this family story, how might that change the way we see each other, and maybe even ourselves, today?